Hi, and welcome to a Small Medium at Large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate stories that heal. Today, we have guests that I was able to meet by being a guest on their show about a year and a half ago. And all I kept thinking was, who is Bigfoot and the Bunny? Well, today you're going to find out. Chris Carr and Kristen Johnson make up Dark Horse Paranormal. Besides hosting the internet shows Dark Horse Paranormal Podcast and Bigfoot and the Bunny, they are avid phenomena researchers and investigators. They believe that while spirituality is most often a subjective experience, there is an objective reality that we all traverse through and can only understand through the lens of consciousness. Theology and ancient history leaves us fingerprints and other clues, but many truths are still not fully understood. We feel consciousness connects us all with all things and ascribe to the theory of Pansychism, which allows for consciousness to possibly be attributed to all matter in some way. We approach the discarnate in a state of deep respect, and we stand in awe of the others, those entities that are seemingly not of human origin. So, listeners, let's welcome our guests today, Chris and Kristen. It's wonderful to have you here on A Small Medium at Large.
Thank you, Gail. It's wonderful to be here.
I have to let our listeners know that we're actually speaking to a couple, and that they have met and that they have been together for some years. And so what I'd really like to do is find out how you met and what happened in your childhoods that led the two of you down this path of research and investigation into the paranormal.
You should go first.
All right. Well, we have a kind of an interesting story because we grew up a town away from each other, and, naturally our paths would cross or traverse at different times, but it happened, I don't know, an unusual amount and in strange ways. When we were kids growing up, our parents were antique dealers, and while we think they knew each other, we're not totally sure because they're deceased now. We would attend some of the same events, that is to say, flea markets that were out of the area, not even close to our homes. There was a time where I had a band that rehearsed at a mutual friend of ours, antique shop garage, if you will, that is right by a haunted location. It's a natural rock called Anawan Rock. It's this gigantic rock where Chief Anawan took his last stand and marked the end of King Philip's War, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. And this was a place that Kristen, who is also an only child like myself, would play at as a child. There would be other things as well. You used to come see my bands later when I was working more as a professional musician in my 20s.
Later on in life.
That's right. That's right. And you worked with my ex-wife.
I did.
and made an indelible mark there, apparently, because I remember her coming home one night saying, "Who is this Kristen Johnson?" She was talking about you at work.
I had asked, I saw Carr. I saw, her name in Carr, and I said, "Oh, I know a Carr. I know a Christopher Carr, or Chris Carr." And she's like, "Well, how do you know him?" I was like, "Oh, my friend, one of my best friends dated him, which he remembers what I was wearing, because that was basically
that's right.
First time we met
I
was in high school.
And Kristen was there with the girl I was picking up, and I actually remember what she had on that day. So it's just weird things. And like I said, my ex-wife was like seemingly very concerned, like, who is this Kristen that I'm working with? And that would be much later after high school. So it was interesting. We would both go on to have children and our relationships, and it would be after that we actually got together as a couple. But we had a lot of synchronicities, if you will, and seemingly crossed each other's path many times prior to that.
That's what we call them.
And want to say the fact that both your parents worked in the antique business and how all those objects that the two of you were seeing coming and going, that the energies that must have been on them from the fact that they were old,
Mhm.
I think it was already in your future that it was being laid out there during the work of your parents.
Very
That's right.
true. Yes.
That's right.
I had a different experience. Growing up, I grew up on a farm, an old farmhouse with my mom and dad. Again, I was an only child, and I was kind of traumatized from a being and a spirit, an entity, I'll say, and a spirit. And I can define them differently from the feeling. It was pretty intense at times. Even in, I know about the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, but it was even during the day that they would bother me. One was a shadow figure, and the other was one that was, I don't know if you've ever seen the Conjuring, the Nun movies. It looked like that. It looked like the Nun. And I can't even see it scroll. I have to scroll by it now. I can't even look at it. It's still kind of traumatizing to me. So since I had those experiences, I was afraid all the time. I told my parents, of course, they didn't believe me. And there was at some point that my best friend was over my house, and she was sitting in the back of my room, and my mom had called me, and we had an open floor. It was like a loft, and we were upstairs in my room. And I went to the top of the stairs, and I said, yeah, I looked down, I said, yes, Mom. And I felt these two huge hands on my back and just pushed me down the stairs. And I was just like freaking out. My mom was freaking out. Everybody's freaking out. My friend just stood there. She didn't know what happened. So that was definitely traumatizing to me some more. So, I mean, I'd have tea parties by myself, and I had a doll that was a pull string, and the doll would go off by itself a lot. It had like a what is it, a wool body, but like vinyl hands, feet, and face, had hair, and the head would move when you'd pull the string, and it was constant, and it would sing, and it was constantly singing and going off by itself. And I'm like, stop torturing me, or stop it, I'd be saying. And my mother would always ask, who are you talking to? You got an imaginary friend? I'm like, no, they're bothering me, which I couldn't really say much at the time because I really didn't know what they were. So yeah, and then I learned how to, I could see things and feel things, and and hear. And I just growing up with that, I learned how to block it all out. So then I've done that most of my life, and I didn't want anything to do with this at all. And then Chris came around.
Right. And I also had my own haunted childhood experiences, which are very vivid. At a very young age, my parents had divorced when I was pretty young, but when they were still together at the time, we lived in a house that's actually maybe a quarter mile from where we are right now. I feel like this area of Rhode Island is just sort of a haunted area, but we'll talk more about that in New England and its history. But this house, they swore that it was haunted, and they didn't agree on anything. And years later, they would tell the same ghost stories, if you will, of which we had a few. But my own experience is this vivid recollection of having these. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the brand Steiff. Steiff was a German company known for making the teddy bear, as in Teddy Roosevelt. And when you see like craft type bears now, they're kind of based on the Steiff creations, like handmade items with nicely done. Well, I had these clown dolls, one very tall, it was a little taller than myself, and one that I could hold in my hands. And they talked to me. At least this is my memory of it. I'm not saying that their balsa head mouths opened up and actually cracked and spoke evil things to me, but they seemingly, in my memory, talked to me. And the larger one was always trying to kill my parents, was plotting their murder. And the smaller one kind of acted as like an intermediary between us, letting me in on his plans. So I have these horrific memories and just being and traumatized and like this really great fear that this clown was going to murder my parents at some point, and in my memories, it would run out of the room. Now, how much of this happened when I was in bed, and Kristen mentioned hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, which is something we talk about a lot. Hypnagogic states are where you're in the process of falling to sleep, and hypnopompic is where you're waking up, and you're kind of in that in-between land. I think a lot, at least in my experience, that probably was the case. I think I might have been because I kind of remember being in my room. I think I might have been in bed. It might have been around bedtime. Maybe not solely in those states like Kristen mentioned, but at least part of the time. And this gives us a clue as to things like alien abduction phenomena. The real joy of having a show like ours, where we talk to so many people, is that we get to hear their experiences, and we hear a lot of the same stories over and over. Although the villains in those stories may be different, they may be UFOs outside windows, an alien, a gray alien coming into the bedroom, things of that, or they may be shadow people. It's not uncommon. I'm not sure why the shadow figure is so prevalent, but they seem to be in these states, and it's almost like those states act as a sort of portal, and your brain is kind of getting into the alpha state and maybe deeper, like a theta state or something. And I think it just opens a door to something else to maybe interject itself. I think science tends to point to these things as figments of our imagination, and certainly, how many children have a monster under their bed, et cetera, et cetera. But I think sometimes that monster may have, some sort of intent or a reality to it that should be taken seriously. It seems like almost everybody we talk to, and I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people, have had a paranormal experience, a maybe UFOlogical, like an experience with the aliens, or some other kind of trauma. Mostly the first two things, but there sometimes other traumas too.
Haunted childhoods.
In their childhoods, that seems to be a motivator for why they're interested in it later in life. It's almost like they want to know the answers, like, was that real? Or, maybe not consciously, but it's just something that we've noticed with our guests.
I want to say that when I was answering emails at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and we called me Dr. Gale for these emails, this was the common thing that I found, was that it would be a parent writing in that they don't know what to do because the child is having unusual experiences, and they feel afraid to remember what their past might be. And I always ask them, well, is there anyone else in your family who had paranormal things that happened? Was there a time when maybe because of religious reasons or other things that it was cut out or shut off, or you were told not to believe in any of this? And inadvertently, they will all always remember a grandmother or somebody who was having these kind of experiences, but then they grew up and people would tell them not to talk about it. And it's only when they get back and really get in touch. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that shows like yours are going on, so that the other people who haven't been able to get up and speak about it get inspired to be able to share and get in touch with that, and maybe resolve something in their mind that's been there for years and years. I myself had an experience with the Greys, and I've always cut it off as non-existing, and that it was some bizarre dream-like crazy thing that I don't know what happened and where I went and how I got back. But when I started listening to shows like yours and other shows and hearing such common stories, it makes it hard to not believe that there might be something to this.
That's right.
That you're doing this.
And having that platform is something that we're actually proud of. We have a core audience that joins us, some of which have referred to us as a safe place, which we feel honored by, because we are giving that platform where somebody will come out and just be completely honest about their experiences, and there's something in there they relate to. It may be deep down,
Mhm.
it may be something they can't talk about at work, maybe with their spouse. I mean, situations vary, but if you come on our show or listen to it or participate with your questions, you're going to get honest answers in a non-judgmental environment.
Absolutely.
And people, there hasn't been a lot of places until recently, I think, for people to talk about those things. I think people were just kind of silencing up. I myself did. I didn't talk about it for 40 years or whatever, so
Right.
and it's because it was an unknown I couldn't even share with anybody because it seemed too crazy.
Especially
I agree.
when we were growing up, it was a little different, and you had to go to the library and use the Dewey Decimal System to kind of figure out, like, somebody else have a story like this, or you're reading a ghost story that may or may not be true, could be fiction, may not be. You're kind of hoping maybe this is real. But some of those stories might have been exaggerated, not unlike TV today, and then there were people like Jeffrey Mishlove, who you're very familiar
Yes.
with, who is like a huge influence on us in a way, in a good way, although our show isn't like Jeffrey's New Thinking Aloud or Thinking Aloud. It's an influence on us because the kind of guests that he has. In fact, when people ask me, like, hey, what ghost shows do you watch? Do you watch, because there's so many, I tell them to watch that, in your own show, and
yes,
become familiar with people who have dedicated their lives to these things, and can speak to it on such a robust educational level. You can definitely learn from them, and then if you're having your own experiences, relate to it in that way. Like, say, somebody like your friend Stanley Krippner, who I know had a birthday recently, and we were talking about offline, in his apport collection. A lot of people in our paranormal realm have never heard of apports, and it's a fantastically paranormal thing to occur, to have an object materialize out of thin air.
Yes, I was wondering if you could describe that to our audience in case some of them don't know what an apport is.
Right. Sometimes it's money or a jewel or a ring, or it could be a cup, or it could be anything really, but it's something that seemingly materializes out of thin air in a paranormal event.
Yes, and I didn't know much about this either. And when I came to visit Stanley, because he only lives 45 minutes from us, and I went to visit him, and he had me hold these different, how do you say it? Apport? Is that the right way?
Apport. Yeah, I tend to say apport.
I say apport as
but
well.
It sounds so close to airport. I might be getting that wrong. I think that might be apport.
And when I held them in my hand, they were different stones. And he had been in Brazil or somewhere when these had appeared. I had no idea he was shipping them off to somewhere in England. There's actually research places that are, I'm not sure which place it is in England, where they're collecting all of these and studying the properties of them to find out, is there electrical energy coming off them? Is there something different about them than if it was just a regular stone, or whatever the objects are? And they're keeping a collection of all of the ones that are being sent to them. They don't send it back to you. It stays in this investigated research of these items. And so that's where they were going. So Stanley asked me, he said, here, hold these before I'm going to be shipping them off to this place in England so that they will be studied. So I thought that was fascinating, that I didn't even know studies were being done on these things like this.
We didn't either. That's wonderful. Please keep us up to date with that. We'd love to know about them.
I believe there's actually a couple of museums dedicated to them, maybe one in Canada and one in the Philippines. I'm not sure if they're still there, but I think Stanley may have talked about them on Jeff's show.
I'll have to ask him where he sent it to, and I'll get that info for you.
He had said that it was in the Philippines. It was in a small museum, but it was in somebody's house. For that. So
fascinating.
That is,
and something you don't see every day, certainly. No. I think a lot of the people doing the paranormal research come across things like electronic voice phenomena, or some sort of ITC, instrumental transcommunication method to communicate with spirit. At the end of the day, it's all spirit communications, but sometimes they communicate with objects and will give you something or move something. How many times have we lost our keys? So you have to wonder, geez, when you found them in a place you didn't expect, perhaps they are now an airport.
It's either that or the
And,
cats did it. I don't know.
I mentioned all the
chemical
little
composition that
gremlins,
fired to the
gremlins
spirit.
taking your stuff,
But
Yes.
it's certainly, that's a big influence on us. And not that our show is like that. We have, some of the same guests, but we have a lot of different guests too.
Mhm.
And we talk about things like cryptids and aliens, and we get into all sorts of things.
Consciousness.
And consciousness.
Yes.
That's right.
Could you tell our listeners, if they wanted to tune in, how they would find your show, so that if they're listening now, they'd be able to write it down?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we would like people to go to our YouTube if possible. It's a platform we're trying to build up. And the web URL for that is www.youtube.com/@Dark Horse Paranormal. And it's all like one word with no spaces in it. Dark Horse Paranormal. Dark Horse being an underdog. And we're sort of an underdog at tackling this paranormal stuff at our age, I think.
So I was wondering about, when you've done these things, you've also done research in, am I right in saying haunted houses or haunted places? And the area in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where you live, there's a lot of places for you to investigate. And I was wondering if there's any that you'd like to just share with us that might have been extremely frightening or extremely communicative, or one where you had a lot of experience with the haunted or ghost person that you might have been trying to contact.
One of them would be my house that I'm living in right now.
Okay.
Oh, great.
It was
all be over.
it was built in 1740.
Oh,
We are built on the start of King Philip's War, which we'll get into in a few minutes. It was the bloodiest war with Native Americans
Per capita. Bloodiest war in America per capita.
So earlier I'd said I blocked everything out and didn't want anything to do with this. I still knew there were things going on all the time, but I just kept, ignoring them all. And what had happened was Chris has been on teams for a long time, different paranormal teams. And I've never watched any like Ghost Hunters or Ghost Adventures. Didn't want to know what it was doing. I was scared. So one time I had called him, I had said to him, look, my place, there's something going on. Things were actually being thrown across the room. I'm like, it's, and we've been going together for about, I don't know, 3 years already. And I was like, and I just didn't want anything to do with him when he would go out places and things and investigate. But it was just, it got to the point where I needed to know what was going on. So I actually had him come over and do a 20-minute session of an spirit box, which is ITC, and also a recorder. And I don't know if you put any clips in or not, but
yeah. So what had happened with that is that the activity had gotten worse, and Kristen, again, because of her childhood, was very turned off to the paranormal. As she mentioned, I had been on different paranormal teams and done some of the residential and public type of investigating. And as we dated, it kind of slowed down because she really was turned off by it. She really didn't want anything to do with it. And I was doing it less and less. But, I had some equipment, nice digital recorders and what we call a spirit box. And I'll explain that in a moment. But basically, she said, okay, I think we should probably do a session because this activity is accelerated in some way. And this was things like footsteps coming up her stairs. She lives on the second floor. There were objects on her refrigerator that were, darting across the kitchen, seemingly unexplained. I believe your refrigerator door opened by itself.
And it's really hard to
and
open.
It's a difficult door to open. It's an old refrigerator. You really got to pull it. And this sort of thing.
My child's hearing me calling his name when I don't. Yeah.
Right, which is a little spooky, right?
Yeah.
It's be like, well, no, I didn't say that. Oh, really, Mom? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So what we did was 10 minutes of just having a digital handheld recorder, but a nice one, asking questions, pausing between the questions to see if we get a reply, what we maybe don't hear but goes on the recorder, and then using a spirit box or a ghost box. They have different names, but that is an ITC, communication device. Yes, that basically the seek function on a radio is disabled, and it'll continue to scan stations, and it goes through all the stations
really fast.
And they're somewhat controversial in a way, because the idea of a false positive certainly is not beyond the realm of a spirit box, right? There's going to be things like commercials and things as it's working its way through the stations. But what we look for are like the same voices that continue through the band, or extremely relevant answers to our questions. I'll pause for a moment and play just one clip where you'll hear Kristen's name very clearly. And
this is in her home.
This is in her home from that same original session. And then it kind of says behind it, please help me afterwards, but her name is most clear.
Oh, is that what you're hearing?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Oh, I can't wait to play it back.
Sounded like Kristen.
So you may have heard that, Kristen, hopefully through there. I don't know if I had it loud enough. And we can add that or not add it. But we were getting, relevant things there. We're kind of getting, hey, Kristen, please help me. And that's a common thing we hear from the other side. We either seem to hear, please help me, or get out.
Get out.
Which is kind of funny. Like, you want some help, and now get out. And I don't know what they mean by that.
Or like, get out, and the other ones want help. So.
It's fairly common.
Two things are coming up to me. One is, and I have this in my own life, where we repeat things. So here, Kristen grew up in a house where she was, as a child, experiencing haunting. Now she's in a house with her child, and her child is experiencing haunting.
Yes.
But she needs to be able to now approach it because of you with a whole different, open and positive attitude. Because one of the things I just want to say to listeners while they're hearing this is that it's not necessarily the spirit or ghost or entity or whatever you want to call it is trying to hurt or harm you in any way. There are some that may have negative energy that are coming from that sort of a place. But there are also many that I think that are maybe like lost souls or people who they don't know what happened and they've died a violent death, or somebody has murdered them, or things that have happened to leave them confused. So the spirit is there confused and doesn't know how to get out or how to get help. And they're really reaching out. But because we're told to be afraid of these things, we get scared. And this sounds to me, I mean, I could be wrong, but this sounds like maybe somebody was trying to really communicate with you.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah, we certainly think so. So we had all this data, and there were, voices coming across the tape recorder, including saying her name again, that were not there, right? That weren't us, and there was no radio on. There was nobody home. And we heard these kind of whispery voices going, hey, Kristen, and different things.
Yeah.
And it was like a surprising amount of data from my experience on those teams. It's a situation where you're in a house and you're there all night and you have like 130 hours of data to listen to, hoping to hear one little whisper somewhere and just pray that it isn't someone's stomach grumbling.
Right.
So we got 20 minutes like packed full of data, and it blew my mind.
It did.
I was so excited. I'm like, oh my God, Kristen, you're not going to believe what's on the recording. And she wouldn't even listen to it. She was so freaked out.
3 weeks. It took me 3 weeks to listen to that because I could hear a little bit coming back on the recorder. He's sitting on the bed with the headphones on, and he's listening, and I could hear a little bit, and then I hear my name, and I'm like, oh my God, and still traumatized by everything. And he's like, you gotta hear this. Of course he's yelling because he's got the headphones on. I'm like, I'm out. I have to leave the room. I couldn't, but it did. Finally, I broke down and I listened to it, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. So within the next few months after that, I've gotten myself more into it, and a year has passed and I gotten a little more in tune. Then I started growing and learning about myself even more. And then I'm like, I'm kicking myself in the butt. So I should have did this when I was a child and not this so late stage of life here. So,
and just to circle back on something you said about like why they're there, why they're trying to communicate, there's a theory that some spirits who have not crossed over, whatever that exactly means, are earthbound spirits, and maybe they're afraid of judgment, or they're watching over their property, or there's some reason, they might have done something really bad in their life and they're worried God is going to judge them and send them to hell.
Depending on their religion, yes.
Yeah, it could be very religious based, or some other factor that keeps them from moving on, as it were. I'm not sure exactly where they cross to. Everybody uses that light word a lot. There seems to be something to that. So we would go on to have more experiences. One of our favorite places that we began investigating is a cemetery, and I know they don't like the publicity. We've mentioned, well, we can mention their nickname, I guess. It's called Spider Gates, and that's because of the unusual iron gates that are in front of it. And within that cemetery, which is a Quaker cemetery or society of friends, we had quite a few very notable experiences that we put into podcasts. If you look up Dark Horse Paranormal wherever you get your podcasts, you'll find some on this, or we talk about it on the show occasionally. But Mary Dyer was one of a group of Quakers that would eventually be hung for the crime of being Quaker in Massachusetts, then known as the Mass Bay Colonies. This group would eventually be known as the Boston Martyrs. The Quakers were often tortured and maimed for the simple belief that they could speak to God without a priest or any kind of middleman. They would often be arrested before they could get off the boats carrying them from England. It was not uncommon for them to have their ears cut off or have their tongue impaled with a hot iron poker or similar device. Mary was known to give Bible classes and was eventually kicked out of the colony and would end up retreating to Portsmouth, Rhode Island, neighboring state, the state we're in now, because they were not as opposed to the Quakers, but would frequently return to Massachusetts, particularly Boston, to support and defend the ones coming over on the boats from England, these tortured and arrested Quakers. And this would lead to her eventual execution. But one of the reasons she was kicked out of the Mass Bay colonies was that she had given birth on October 17th, 1637, to a deformed stillborn baby, which is a very sad fact. This baby was buried privately, but the word had reached the Governor Winthrop, and he had it exhumed on March of 1638 before a large crowd. And he described it, and this is a quote: "It was of ordinary bigness. It had a face, but no head, and the ears stood upon the shoulders and were like an ape's. It had no forehead, but over the eyes 4 horns, hard and sharp. 2 of them were above 1 inch long, the other 2 shorter, the eyes standing out, and the mouth also, the nose hooked upward, all over the breast and back, full of sharp pricks and scales like a thornback, and the navel and all the belly, with the distinction of the sex, were where the back should be, and the back and hips before where the belly should have been. Behind, between the shoulders, it had 2 mouths, and in each of them a piece of red flesh sticking out. It had arms and legs as other children, but instead of toes, it had on each foot 3 claws like a young fowl with sharp talons." Indeed, the Quakers were treated as we know witches to have been treated in those days.
So the baby suffered obviously from some sort of ailment when it
Right,
was
some
born.
sort of deformity.
Mhm.
And it's actually a very sad fact, but she used, or I should say he used, that evidence of the exhumed baby as evidence to kick her out of mass bay colonies, which very interesting. And she was an outspoken
Terrible.
woman, not unlike how society viewed the witches at the time. They tended to be almost overwhelming majority female, and tended to be the ones that would speak out against the system, if you will, would make some noise in society. These were the people that were being prosecuted.
Was
Just
also,
very interesting.
weren't also some of them being prosecuted because they were healers?
That's
Where
Yes.
right.
they were actually helping people, but using what they didn't consider the right forms of healing. So that was considered a witch instead of actually somebody who was helping.
Yes.
How
Yes.
hard that must have been
I know.
for people.
Yes, and witchcraft and magic is such an interesting subject in itself historically. Through those years prior, like going back to the 1500s, in medieval Europe, like Scotland in particular, there were so many women executed. They would be strangled and then burned. They weren't typically burned at the stake as we imagine them alive. They would tend to strangle them first, but these people used magic on a day-to-day basis. It was folk magic. It was things like healing. There may have been some spells, but they were things like, I need milk from my cow, and maybe I'll take the milk of my neighbor's cow and transform it into my own cow. And it was part of their day-to-day lives. It was simple folk magic. It started with sort of the acknowledgement that there were fairies, the fae, and later this would get, the moniker would change into the devil, and they were now devil worshippers. And of course, this gave governments and religious figures the authority to take them out of the population, if you will.
Mhm.
Do you think there's anything to, like, we just passed Halloween and we just passed Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead.
Yes.
And I have to say, I just did a ceremony on a family member who passed away and had a Buddhist death. And when I went to see her body, and her whole head was covered in beautiful marigolds. And when I went to go see her body and do this blessing, or blessing on her before in my shamanic way, the whole room was just lit up with the most positive, beautiful, loving energy. And when I looked at her form laying there, it was identical to how a Day of the Dead is presented. When you see the statues and everyone's in their clothes or their thing, and how the face looks. And there's something that's very alive about the Day of the Dead statues. It doesn't feel like, she was the image of that. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a deceased person really replicate what the Day of the Dead represents, which is honoring the souls of the people who have passed.
Day of
So in your
Remembrance.
area where you had just had Halloween and Day of the Dead, is it considered at that time All Hallows Eve, or where there's a more opening at that time for spirits or discarnate spirits to come and reach out to people? Was it a very, is there a lot more activity during this end of October, beginning of November, like is celebrated in other places?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because we had this conversation right around Halloween, on our kind of Halloween episode, if you will. And one of the more interesting points of it, because I asked that very question to our guest, do you think the veil is thinner, on Halloween or the day after? And the reply I got from a friend of ours, her name is Sorceress Cagliostro, is potentially because of the collective consciousness, meaning that because we believe it to be, that perhaps it is. And we just watched a gentleman named Randall Carlson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's quite a brilliant guy.
Mhm.
And he talks a lot about the Younger Dryas period, this period going back, how many years? 12,500 years or so
Although,
ago, where there was perhaps a cataclysmic event that occurred on Earth, erasing most of the population.
It was
And
a comet, Younger Dryas comet.
the comet, yes. And what he's referring to in this particular lecture he was given was that cultures around the world seemingly celebrate those same 3 days or so, the very end of November, or I'm sorry, end of October, beginning of November, as a remembrance to the dead, even though those cultures are unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
In this meaning going back thousands of years.
Over 10,000 years.
Right,
Wow.
right.
Yeah.
And it seemed to point to potentially it being this cataclysmic event. And maybe this was a reason why these diverse cultures internationally chose those 3 days to have a holiday more or less dedicated to remembering those who have passed, which is fascinating. You know,
Fascinating.
right? We think about Mexico and the Day of the Dead, but there are other cultures globally that all chose those days. And I don't want to use all his information. I mean, look him up. He's a very interesting fellow. And he had a good deal of data to support that. So if that's true, you know, that would plant it firmly within the collective consciousness, really, of all peoples, that there is something special about those days
Most
where
definitely.
the veil, may in
Yeah.
fact be thinner.
And I think it's right. It's in more places than just Mexico and the United States that are celebrating that or bringing attention to the honoring of the dead. I have a few other questions, and I was wondering if we could jump to something else that I wanted to talk about when I was reading your bio, because I had never heard this term panpsychism before, and I'm not sure why it never was mentioned to me. I don't know why I've never heard that. You know, I've heard of the telekinesis, we got you this, I mean, it's all these different names for things, but I had never heard this one. And I was wondering if you could explain to our audience what that word means and what that's about.
So panpsychism is the view that mentality is fundamental and ubiquitous in the natural world, per the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is a philosophy, not necessarily a science. But what this means to us is that because we're all made of the same stuff, essentially, the same sort of matter with very little differences, like there might be atomic differences, and everything can more or less hold a consciousness. Has the potential, anyways, to have a consciousness. This is very similar to animism. That is, a feature of shamanic culture that you're familiar with, where, this spirit of trees exists. There's a spirit of the wind, of the river. These things may have a consciousness of themselves, things that people ordinarily wouldn't associate with having a consciousness. We believe in it. We believe that trees are very conscious and aware. Science has shown us that trees can communicate and are aware of, say, their offspring, and they do this through mycelium, like a network, basically like a data network under the ground, which
Fungus,
is a kind of fungus, right? Which mushrooms come from. It's the fruit of mycelium. And they can starve off other trees through that network that they consider a threat, things of that nature. That shows us that the idea of, say, a haunted object is a very real possibility. If a person believes that their clock is haunted and at midnight it'll groan and make a noise that scares them, we can't totally rule that out as, say, schizophrenia. Perhaps it does. Perhaps a consciousness does pervade the wood of that clock and metal, and that is the effect of that. I also want to note again, we don't think that most spirits and paranormal activity is evil or nefarious. It's not all a horror movie. We have both had some kind of scary experiences, but that's not the norm.
No.
What this brings me back to again is I keep thinking of Kristen's childhood and yours, and the fact that, because I've done things where I go to someone's house and I do like a shamanic cleansing or blessing, and objects can hold energy.
Yes.
And so sometimes when, I have a friend who always goes to the hospice thrift store and he brings home all these things from the hospice thrift store. Well, I went in there and it felt like the house was full of some kind of anger, and there was just anger in the house. So I did like a cleansing to remove the anger. And when he came back in, I said, I felt a lot of anger in this particular spot in your house. And he said, oh, that's exactly where I've been experiencing it. And I said, I think you need to get rid of some of these objects that you have, or you need to individually take them and either put them in water from the ocean or bless them with smoke or do something to like cleanse some of them. And to me, that would hold the fact that maybe objects do hold. It's not that the person is in the object, it's just holding the energy and consciousness of some event or person that took place. Is that what this is sort of about?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Part of it. Well, there's my Boston coming through me, right?
New England accent.
Part of it. Go park your car. I think people's just owning an object or something they really valued, they're putting a lot of their own energy into it. And then you can look at something that maybe is handcrafted, or say like a painting where a person is inspired, and the nature of inspiration. Boy, that might be a topic for another podcast.
So altogether.
But they're putting all that energy into the creation of it. And yeah, maybe it can hold some of that. One of the things we wonder about is, when people have extreme emotional experiences, and where those emotions end up, whether they're good emotions or bad emotions, something negative. It could be something like road rage, or maybe something much greater, like a childbirth and an experience of love, giving birth to your child and what that feels like, to that bond. I tend to think, or we tend to think, that those emotions don't end in that moment, that they might live on, and they might be responsible for some of these non-human entities, right? So we mentioned demons before, and the dreaded D word.
It's dreaded D word.
But historically, demons are a different thing, right? In like the ancient Greeks called them daemons, and they put an A in there. But some people also pronounce that word as demons. It depends on who you talk to as to how they pronounce it. And they were not necessarily evil things in any way. In fact, they were considered to be the messengers to the gods, to their gods and goddesses. They existed as sort of a middleman, getting back to that middleman, between them to carry those messages. Interestingly enough, the word angel is derived from the word messenger in its origins. So you have this thing that kind of exists in between. And when you think about something like praying really hard and putting all your intent and emotion into a prayer, perhaps you are dealing with something that it might not be physical, has some kind of value, some kind of weight or currency in a way, to reach some other place. It may go on. Perhaps these things even collect, eventually, because like attracts like, and you may have all these negative emotions in the world kind of spooling around each other, at least or in groups that do take on a consciousness of their own, per panpsychism, per animism. And then that becomes something more like the modern day demon or angel, as far as what our human perception is, because we only know how to describe these things, a certain way, and we're almost limited by our language a lot of times. To go back to Governor Winthrop, one of the earliest UFO sightings in the United States was done by Puritans in his day. He kept a diary, and in that diary, he wrote, and this goes to 1639, again, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colonies. He recorded that a man named James Everell, who he described as, quote, a sober, discreet man, and two others had been rowing a boat in the Muddy River, which is right off the Charles River, a well-known river that exists today in Boston. when they saw a great light in the sky. And I quote, when it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square. And also, quoting here, when it ran, it contracted into the figure of a swine. So it was basically a flying, flaming pig that these three supposedly sober gentlemen saw while they were rowing the boat.
It's based on people's perceptions at the time as well.
That's right, because they didn't know how to describe a UFO, right? So over the course of 2 or 3 hours, the boatman reported that the object ran as swift as an arrow, darting back and forth across the sky at a distance of approximately 2 miles. And diverse and other credible persons saw the same light after about the same place. Winthrop noted in his diary. The governor wrote that when the unidentified flying object in the sky faded away, the 3 Puritans in the boat were stunned to find themselves about 1 mile upstream with no memory of rowing their boat against the tide. So this is the same sort of time-lapse behavior that we see in ufology today, that abductees often report. And like many of our guests, they'll have this sort of time lapse. You know, they won't know what happened for the last 6 hours per se, when they had this sort of abduction experience and the aliens were there, or they were on the ship, or what have you. So it's nothing new, right? To have this sort of phenomena occur.
An unidentified flying object in
That's
16 and reporting it back in 1668 or whenever you say.
39.
That's right. And they reported it as a flaming pig in the sky because they would know what a pig was, right? So if it had this shape, it was lights on the sky, they may have thought, well, it looked like a swine to me, you know, that kind of thing.
So, and that's also if you go to Mayan or Aztec, aren't there a lot of things inscribed in stone that are showing things coming from the sky? Isn't that a phenomena that's been recorded in also in ancient stone in places?
Yes. And the indigenous people of the Americas reported about, or, you know, wrote down or in paintings described these star people.
Yeah, the best, I can't remember the name of it, but we just watched a documentary about this in South Africa, I think, or where they went back to a school that 30 years later with the children. Yes. Did you see that?
I saw bits and pieces of it. Yes. It was so interesting.
It was an amazing documentary. And when you're hearing and seeing the people's faces who have had the experience as a child and now they're being interviewed as adults, I thought that was such evidence that something is going on, obviously. And a great documentary, but I can't remember the name of it. I
forgot the name of it as well.
Slips through my tongue right this minute.
Yes. And speaking of the indigenous people,
I was just going to ask you about hauntings of the Native American.
That's right. So Kristen's house was erected where what is known as King Philip's War began. And as we mentioned, I think briefly earlier, this was the bloodiest war between the white man and the natives per capita, meaning because there weren't a lot of people here at the time, but a lot of them, you know, per capita died in this war. So it is thought that this area is haunted, and it's referred to in paranormal circles as the Bridgewater Triangle. And there are a few triangles out there. I have some ideas about why triangle is such a popular shape for these areas, but that is our local one. And the indigenous people, you know, had very good reason to haunt a place for whatever reason, whether
most definitely
it was the fact that there was murder, there were murder and rapings, scalpings on both sides, right? I think in our culture growing up, we always think of scalpings as something, the bad Indians did, right? To the white men in the cowboy movies and that sort of thing. But the history is completely different. In fact, the lands themselves could have been scarred, prior to that.
Mhm.
In the pre-Columbian era, that is before Christopher Columbus murdered, raped, and enslaved the Caribbean and southern portions of the Americas, the continent and our indigenous people had limited exposure to the widespread diseases of Europe, and therefore had limited immunities against smallpox, bubonic plague, chickenpox, cholera, diphtheria, influenza, malaria, measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, various STDs, and the common cold. In April 1614, before the Pilgrims, Captain John Smith landed at the then unfounded Ipswich, Massachusetts, what would become Ipswich. Native Americans in the North Shore area were believed to have numbered in the thousands at that time, but 20 years later, when Ipswich actually was founded and settled, the Agawam people have been reduced to less than 100 natives. It is thought that over 18 million Native Americans lived in North America alone prior to the explorers and settlers that crossed the Atlantic, bringing with them a tidal wave, a disease between the years 1616 and 1619. The native population was reduced to just 10% of what it had been. Puritan colonists arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, only to find empty and abandoned villages for them to occupy. Although not taught in children's history classes, it was no secret that the early settlers, due to their lack of survival skills, would resort to digging up the graves of Native Americans and even their own children to find sustenance in their exhumed flesh.
Oh, God.
That is a reason for a haunting, in our opinion.
Yes.
Mhm.
Because tragedies, basically terroristic behaviors of the white people invading, the Puritans invading the land that belonged to the indigenous people, and the way we treated them, and then we're treated back. There's lots of reasons there for land to be scarred, for spirits to stick around and remain earthborn. If you want to get into things like curses and so that sort of thing, there are plenty of legends around these things, and our area is just filled with them.
It's like you're right. You're in the seat of where there's still so much activity from the past that's still very strong activity. When I traveled around Europe, and this was 45 years ago, and I was pregnant at the time. And when you're pregnant, you're so much more sensitive to things around you. And when we'd go into castles and ancient places, I would run out screaming, like I could feel the tortures that would be going on in these places. And it was hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. It did not matter. I was like terrified. And other people could just sit and look at it like it was historical. I couldn't feel it like it was historical. I felt like,
No, that I understand
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
There's a lot of energy, and especially when it's trauma energy.
Yes.
It's and I do believe in the spirit of the water and the spirit of the plants, and in shamanic teachings, you feed and honor those spirits. You bring food to the fire. You feed the fire. It's not just a fire. You put fat in the Mongolian tradition. When you're doing a ceremony with the fire, you place little pieces of fat that each of you throw into the fire to feed the god of the fire. I think the Native Americans and shamanic ways of the ancient times, these were really all good protective teachings that were being shared. But technology, well, everything that's new and whatever, the modern times erased all of that. That's one of the things they say here where we live in the fire area here now in Northern California, that the Native Americans knew how to manage the land correctly. And that we, as whoever is our land management or Army Corps of Engineers or whoever it is, don't know how to manage this. And that's why we're now left with such problems where fire just runs through a whole place and takes away all these people's homes, and things like this happen because we don't know how to honor or respect the land.
It's tragic. It really is. Did you want me to tell you a little bit about our hauntings real quick? Maybe
Yes. Let me see what we're doing in time. Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. Okay.
o'clock.
So I
We
was
ha-
wondering, I'd love to hear about some of the hauntings and if any of them have left you run screaming when you went out, or have they mostly all been really pleasant interactions that you've experienced?
both things. Both things. To circle back to the Quakers, there's a certain Quaker cemetery that we began investigating. Once Kristen had acclimated to the idea of like, okay, maybe we can do this, that we are very respectful. And when we say cemeteries, some people are just turned off by that idea, but please, I can't tell you enough. We go in and clean it. We take trash out.
We bring offerings.
We bring offerings to the spirits. Sometimes that's in the form of tobacco or coins for the
Rum,
gatekeeper of any
whiskey.
particular cemetery. But we came across a child spirit who identified himself as Toby. And Toby told us that he was 7 years old, quite clearly. And I'm going to send you a clip of this. Through that spirit box, he said it repeatedly, and you hear a lot of the same voices, clearly a child's voice. Toby, how old are you? 7, 7, 7.
Then I'd ask.
Kristen asked, 7, 7, 7. So he repeated these things. We had this interaction. We would return to that cemetery over a month later, ask the same questions, get the same answers very clearly. So we feel like the ITC radio was working well at that point. And he went on to tell us some other things, not all of which we heard in real time. When we played back the session we heard him whimpering kind of behind the static,
Sobbing.
and it continues on as the radio is scanning the band. You hear this child's voice, and then he answers the 7, and then he gets to a point where he says very, very clearly, "Where's mom?" And we were shook by this when we figured this out. Kristen, I remember you calling me at work. You're
Yeah,
like,
it's like,
"Oh my
please don't
gosh,
listen to this at work.
it's so sad. You're
It
not going to
is
believe it." And it is
crying.
actually heart-wrenching. And we say, "Why are you here?" And he goes on to say he was scared to leave. Again, the radio is scanning at a fast rate. So we're not picking up, car commercials or commercial for insurance here.
Right.
This is somebody's voice, and it's all in the same voice. And we were convinced at that point we needed to do something about Toby, and we have no experience in crossing over spirits to the other side. Again, whatever that exactly means, or elevate his spirit to a better place. But we tried. We had talked to a lady named Kat Ironwood. Was the founder of the Lucky Mojo Curio Company and considered kind of a queen of hoodoo, if you're familiar with her name. And we had done an interview with her, and she gave us some ideas. And what Kristen ended up doing is crushing up some herbs and some candy and this sort of thing. And we actually led a trail out of that.
We opened the gates.
Open those gates, and we led him out.
Take my hand, and
that's right. And we kind of walked side by side. And thankfully, there's nobody around because they would have just thought we were bananas. And walked this child spirit out of the cemetery. And since we've returned, we've never been able to capture his voice again. So we hope that it works. We think it does. He was a very notable spirit at the time. But as far as something that might make you run screaming, well, we do have a little story about that. I'll tell real quick because I know we're short of time. But right around that period after Toby, we started to get this very cryptic voice on our spirit box. And it would say things like, "It speaks."
Over and over again.
Over and over.
Escape.
And then it started to add more and more words to it. It speaks English speak. It speaks
ravens and lament.
Ravens and lament. And it got really cryptic. And the thing is, and what made it really scary was that we were obsessing on it. We found that we could get this no matter where our location was. We could get it from our homes. I started to talk about this character, this name, Frank Houghton, kept coming through the box along with the "it speaks." And it started to make these little cryptic sentences that drove us crazy. We were like doing it all the time.
Buried in the woods behind the cemetery.
That's
I mean,
right.
with
We
a
thought-
spike in them. That's how bad it was.
Right, which sounds crazy, but this is
This
based
is
on
what
some of the
it's-
messages that
he
we
was
were
telling us.
getting.
Both of you were hearing the messages
Mhm.
repeatedly.
And the more we heard it and the more we listened to it, which was a lot,
Mhm.
meaning several times a week, we started to get haunted ourselves. And that is to say, Kristen, who, has some psychic gifts, but doesn't typically see things walking across the room
I blocked it all out.
because you block it out
yeah.
naturally. You were seeing things.
Oh yes, I saw at Chris's house. I saw swear to God, a gargoyle. He was up in the air near the tree. It was huge and it had like a monkey face, but it had wings and had long legs, and it was just, I still can picture it. And I ran to Chris's house. I'm like, I am never going back outside again. Ever.
Fortunately, she would venture back out,
I
but
did,
she
but-
was extremely shook by
For
this.
days.
You also saw things like in our shows and playing them back,
Mhm.
right, on your phone.
I had a gray mist come behind me. I was at my own house. I had a big gray mist float behind me. And when it floated behind me, it came up to the camera and made a big hand in the camera that I was, looking through. I mean, it was awful. And I went and I kept playing back and forth, trying to slow it down and speed it up. I'm like, where did this come from? At first, I thought it was my cat jumping up on the table. It comes, this huge, gray mist from right behind me and just made a human hand looking with an arm hand into the camera.
And I had some weird experiences as well as seeing things more or less, moving in my house or flashing. Like when I turn my head, that sort of like corner of your eye thing becoming much more pronounced. Worse things started to happen. I remember sitting on my couch one day and had the little radio in this bag here. And this is called a Faraday bag. And what this does is cut all radio signals from it. So when you put those little radios in these bags, they don't get any radio reception at all. And I had it turned up so I could hear it through the bag, but you're basically supposed to just get static as it scans the bands. And I wasn't. It continued to talk. It speaks stuff and other things that were very cryptic. Needless to say, I opened the bag to take the radio out, and it was like I got hit with what experiences and abductees call a download, where all at once I had this extreme vision, and it was a horrifying vision. It's not one I really am even that comfortable talking about, but it involved my child and like a suicide and blood everywhere. The most horrifying thing that I could possibly imagine hits me all at once, like it was real and I was in the room with it. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I put the box, turned it off. I'm like, all right, that's enough of that. A few minutes later, I went into my kitchen and I just started doing some dishes to keep myself busy. And then I found myself just falling into this rhythm. And I started to get angry. Now, not angry at the voice I had heard or the image that had been given to me, but this sort of random, chaotic anger. And I started having these strange, very foreign thoughts in my head. And I had the idea of what it must feel like to be a serial killer or something like that. And I started getting angry doing the dishes, and I'm kind of tossing the dishes.
Rage.
I started feeling this like uncontrollable rage. Now I didn't lose control. I didn't do anything nuts other than wash the dishes, but my blood pressure went so crazy that I had a wound that wasn't bleeding, started bleeding profusely, a small wound. My blood pressure was going bananas, and this lasted for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. But all I really wanted to do, and I had to stop myself from doing it, was run outside, find a random person, and just hit them in the face. Like commit some violent act. And it made no sense to me because that's not like me. I'm not a violent person. I don't have violent thoughts.
No.
I believe I experienced a temporary possession,
Mild possession.
like a temporary
Possession.
transient, I guess, possession. It passed. I cannot express to you how strong those feelings were, though. And I have to imagine anybody who feels like that for any length of time will commit some sort of atrocity. And I felt like this is pure evil. This is what people who commit these heinous acts feel probably 24/7. And that's when I said, enough.
Yeah.
We've had enough.
We tried to cleanse. We were constantly cleansing and banishing and doing all kinds of things.
It did nothing.
And then what did we do? We ended up just ignoring it.
We had to put it out of our minds. We had to put the spirit boxes away. And this is no longer a party game. It was a naive mistake to bring these things into our home and do them as often as we did, knowing we were talking to something that maybe didn't have our best interests at heart.
But we were trying to help them. That was the whole point,
Kind of like the teenager with the Ouija board kind of thing. That story all the time. Don't play with the Ouija board, and we don't give Ouija boards any particular credence or anything like that. And but we were just so obsessed at this point. It had been weeks of this stuff, and it built up to those moments where we felt like we were haunted, and enough is enough. And we actually said, we're not doing this for a while. We didn't do another session with a spirit box in our house for months and months and months. We changed the whole topic of what we were looking for. In fact, we started to look into the Native American hauntings,
researching, and
just something away from this, what we had dubbed then the Evil AM Band. And we just have a podcast about that with samples and clips and stuff.
We have Toby.
People can look up on, wherever they get podcasts. But that was a real learning experience. And that would be the one that maybe had us up and running. And we've had other things that were scary. We've been in the Conjuring house, and we had weird phenomena happen there. That's a famous place in the paranormal world, and not far from here, the house that's featured, or supposed to be featured, right? Because it's Hollywood, in the original Conjuring movie. And things of that nature. Plus residentials have been, some creepy phenomena.
We try to help people.
That Evil AM Band and its cryptic message was the one that really got us.
I have a question, because I've just been experimenting with something new that I don't know that much about, but it has to do with frequencies. A lot of this having to do with frequencies. Like, do you feel that's what the different bandwidths and things, and that things itself carry frequencies, or there's different frequencies we all. So I had a guest on one of my shows named Randy Zanesis, and he licensed this technology. I'm going to show you the device just to get off. I don't mean to get off topic, but I just wanted to.
We love frequency.
My interest. And this is odd. Oh, here we are. This is what it is. It's called a wish box. Oops. WISH. World Integrity Space Harmonizer is what WISH stands for. And I don't know exactly what's inside of this, but there's some sort of technology in here that's supposed to do something with adjusting the frequencies in your home to a more harmonious space. And recently I've just heard about a specific doctor, Norm Shealy, who used this and wrote back to our friend Randy and spoke with him and said that it's done amazing work in healing him from different, like he's 90 years old or something, and it's given him a lot of relief having this particular frequency thing inside his home. And I just decided to try it myself, not knowing much about frequencies. But during the surgery of my husband David, it would be really normally a very high stress time for me, because I have issues with fear about medical procedures and things. And I put this device on the entire time, and I went through the whole caring for him and him coming back and everything in the complete calm and complete mellow space. And I'm not exactly sure, because I don't know, I'm not a scientific person about what goes on with frequencies, but I find this to be a very interesting thing to be learning about or talking with other people about how frequencies are affecting us and whether this particular little device is doing something to cleanse the frequencies in the space that you're in.
Oh, that's
It
fascinating.
really is.
I would love to learn more about it.
Hmm.
So
Yes.
we'll have to talk about, like, I'm going to have a show with him and I think maybe one of the people who owns the company that's distributing these, and talk about the different effects that it's had on people. I just found it to be a very positive, some sort of, just like when we smudge something or we do things that cleanse our space, there's something about this frequency thing that seems to bring a really nice calmness into your home or room or where you are.
Yourself as well. We
And
all.
yes.
It's like a feng shui in a way, but maybe electronic, right?
Yeah, and it's very, and it's, you know, it's invisible. It's
Mhm.
invisible. And so, and that's where frequencies are, in the invisible, because you were mentioning this was a Faraday bag. Is that what you called it?
Yeah, that's what they call it. It's this a little bag, and I'm not sure what the
Keeps the
materials
frequencies out.
are that are in it, but it immediately shuts out all radio frequencies from entering it.
Mhm.
So when you put in a radio in here and you know it's scanning all those stations, it gets nothing. Right. So
Right.
if you get it to start getting something like
Yeah.
I did, maybe you have a reason to be concerned. Or
Yes, yes.
hopefully the message is positive, right? As they
Right.
usually are.
Well,
But
I'm interested in getting one of those little pouches for this device to protect it if you take it anywhere. But I was thinking, is that like pouch was designed over the actual giant Faraday cage that I've sat in it to do experiments with? It's
well,
electromagnetically shielded room.
well,
Mhm.
that's what it is,
Yes.
right? It's a electromagnetically shielded bag,
Mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
It's in the fibers of the bag. There's something woven in there to do that. And
Fascinating.
yeah, it's rare to get you know, messages when you have a radio in there. You can't have any wires sticking out like a speaker or anything. You have to seal the bag shut. But
That's a good idea for you to get one of those for that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
Yeah, and that seems also, I think it was very smart and wise of you to take that rest after you were finding there was too much activity of a negative, you know, and that you needed to just give yourself some space. That sounded like a good, I've experienced both the negative, scary experiences. It was a very long time ago, but you don't ever forget them when you have them.
no,
It's like giving birth or whatever, you know, it's that once in a life, you know, oh, you're not going to forget this.
the obsession had turned into a form of possession, at least briefly, and hallucination. And that's crazy. I've never felt like that. I felt all these very strong emotions. I held myself back from running out of my house and being crazy. And why? And again, I had this wound and it hadn't been bleeding. It just started
Gushing.
gushing blood, and
There's blood everywhere. It was weird.
was really, that was something. And that's when we said, that's enough.
That's
We're
it.
going to do this. And the way we banished it was to not think about it.
Mhm.
And to be honest with you, we don't speak of it much.
No.
Well, it's
Afraid of
very
you.
nice of you to be able to share that today for some of the listeners who might need to hear that kind of information for something they might be dealing with. I dealt with that once, possession, and it's a very hard thing to describe to somebody when you're feeling an entity that's invisible trying to take over your being. And I think that some of the things that happen when we find people sometimes in institutions is that I've noticed with alcoholism, there's a certain point of, I'm not sure how many years a person is an alcoholic, but it's almost like their spirit and soul is driven out of the body. And during that time, that's when those negative entities can enter and take possession of that person. And I
They-
think sometimes when you see these crazies or people that are doing violent things, it really may not be them that's doing it. It really may be an entity that's working through them because they were on drugs for so long or alcohol for so long that it kind of wiped out their connection to their soul and spirit. I had a catering company and we did this catering for the Salvation Army. And it was a Christmas party. And it was for their big center for all these workers and volunteers. and it was about 150 people. And at the end of the catering, when all the people came through the buffet line, I turned to one of my workers and I said, that's the weirdest catering we've ever done. It was like nobody had a soul. Like everyone that came through was just like a body. They were no longer alcoholics anymore. They were they were right. And there was like no reaching them through your eyes. Like when you look them in the eyes, it was like there was nobody home.
Like a shell.
Yeah, like a shell of a being that was functioning with coffee and food and doing their job and not abusing their bodies or anything anymore. But it was almost like it was so later on that they had been sort of like wiped away somehow.
Yeah.
And it was just an interesting, I mean, I could be wrong on any of these things that I'm sharing, but it was something that I saw for myself and felt like I was looking into people that like they were just the shell of a person.
There's a good deal of work and research in that area, a pretty big body of it. And it was started by people like the Wicklins and during the spiritualist movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who would go into asylums. And the gentleman, I think his name was Carl, was a doctor. And in fact, he was in charge of one of those asylums. And his wife was a psychic, and they would try to remove these attachments, if you will, from the patients, and some of which they would release. And it's sort of controversial, right? Because if a person commits a heinous crime, can you just go in and psychically remove an attachment and let them on the street? Well, maybe it is the attachment that was creating the issue. They certainly thought so. They wrote some books on it. Later, people like Dr. Terrence Palmer, Ida Fiore, among others, would document their research and write about it extensively. There's a whole area dedicated to that. In fact, I saw him on Jeffrey Mishlev's show.
We did.
Some time ago. We had some emails together. I wanted to talk to him on my show about his research, and I believe he passed away, unfortunately.
Yeah, but supposedly he was trying to open a hospital to have people who were diagnosed as schizophrenic or something with a mental illness that actually wasn't. They could tell that it wasn't, and they were trying to release the spirits.
That's right. He wanted to have like a therapist or psychologist work with the individual, as well as a psychic medium who could see the attachments. Right.
It's really interesting.
I'm glad to know there was somebody out there realizing that was a way to be able to help these people.
Yes, that's what Chris and I had said as well.
Yeah. Hopefully his work goes on. There are others that do it, and I think it's a great area. Convincing, the American Medical Association that this is, a valid form of therapy is going to be a bit more difficult. But is there something to it? We think so.
Just quickly before we leave, it's called the Ariel School, the documentary with the
children.
Yes, from Zimbabwe. It's the Ariel School.
And did they call them star children then, or were the children I can't remember whether that had anything to do with that.
No.
Oh, okay. So that was just all right. So can you just repeat it one more time, because it really wasn't a phenomenal documentary to watch.
It's Ariel School, and it's the kids in Zimbabwe. So students in Zimbabwe, yes.
It was fascinating. It gave me a whole other perspective on the possibilities of how UFOs may have been contacting people from so long ago and then now in the present. So I'm going to be winding us down now, but I always like to ask you if there's something else that you want to share before we go, or I'd love to leave on a happy message or a uplifting story about the work that you do doing this podcast and how many people that you're reaching. And you've been doing this for quite a few years now, correct?
Yeah, a few years. I guess a good note to leave on would be how we got our name.
Yes,
Bigfoot. Great.
Bigfoot and the Bunny. That's the name of one of our shows. So we have two shows. On Thursday nights, we have a show called Dark Horse Paranormal Podcast. There are also audio only podcasts out there too. If you're a podcaster, but our main show is a live stream, and you can find that on Facebook, looking for that name, and as well as the YouTube link that I mentioned earlier. But our Saturday show is called Bigfoot and the Bunny. Got to be clear, not in the bunny.
Yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah. There's a lot of little jokes about that. It would be a short-lived experience, I suppose.
Bunny, I'm here from you.
That's right, we do, and you can see that in our background. That's probably one of our favorite objects on that shelf. Thank you so much, Gail.
Yes, thank you
for that. But the story of Bigfoot and the bunny derives from my moving to a new house. I was living in a new house at the time, and we had this big hedge that divided, our yard and a neighbor's yard, and there were a family of bunnies.
They were so cute.
And the hedges, and we used to feed them sometimes. At that time, I think we were having a little bit of sangria, and would perhaps give those bunnies some of the fruit from the sangria, our little drunk bunnies. But there was some phenomena going on out there in that house, some peculiar things going on, and of course we were all into this paranormal stuff, especially at that time, because we were just getting started. And one night we were outside and we were looking at the sky. It was a nice clear night, and we see this object in the sky. It's a bright orange red light, and it's moving across the sky. It's moving much faster than a jet, but slower than like a shooting star, and it was not a satellite. We were quite convinced of it. And this is going back a few years. Satellites seem to be more common now with the advent of Starlink and all of that. And we were looking at it, just watching it go across.
All I could do is point up and say, "Do you see that?" And I did. I watched it sail over the horizon.
And then I said, the next thing you'll see is Bigfoot chasing a bunny. So when it came time to come up with a name for the show, Kristen suggested, "Hey, how about Bigfoot and the Bunny?"
I was only goofing. How about
totally
Bigfoot
kidding?
and the Bunny?
And I said, "Oh, that's it."
I'm like, no way.
That's the name right there. It's so catchy.
Yep.
I love that title. I'm just saying it when I was booked to be on your show, all I kept saying was, "What is Bigfoot and the Bunny?" And now I found it out to be the most wonderful couple that we love to speak to on and off the air. And we're so happy to have you in our lives.
Oh, thank you so much.
And as you as well, and David as well. Thank you so much.
We love you guys.
Love you guys.
Our tagline is a couple's journey into the mysterious, the unknown, and the paranormal. So that's what we're about. It is a couple's journey, and it's something we do together and get to share with other people and just love. So,
well, one day David and I will come out as the other couple, and we'll visit you in Rhode Island, and we'll have to go to a couple of haunted houses or places or cemeteries. And by the way, I love cemeteries also. I find them to be peaceful and lovely places. There's nothing there to fear. It's just a very calm space to go to.
We wholeheartedly agree. They are very peaceful places. We love them. And again, we treat them with respect.
Absolutely.
And we want people to know that because, people kind of look upon people like us a lot of times as like, what are those creepy people doing in this cemetery? Or maybe they vandalize or things of that nature.
We pick up trash,
opposite of that. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure the spirits above are all saying, "Oh God, they're here. So good to know that they're here picking up the yard." So on that note, if there's nothing else to share, I'm going to close our show. Are we good?
Yes. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Gail.
It's just a joy to spend this time with you. I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in. I want to thank you all for the fact that we now have 1,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and that you can find us on Spotify, Google, and all other podcast areas. We hope you join in, listen, share, and have a very wonderful week ahead. Thanks for being here. Bye.